Also in our next group, 11 to 20, includes Nico Collins at 11, Cris at 12 before we go into Tier 3, Matthew. So the break here is between Olave and Devontae Adams.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a clear line there. And honestly, I think in my next rankings update, I might move Waddle ahead of Adams. Adams make me nervous, just with the age and the Minshew and the whole thing. But anyway, let's talk about Nico Collins for a second. 13 full games with C.J. Stroud, average over 91 receiving yards per game, 18.8 fantasy points per game, had a 23% target share in all of his healthy games. And, the other thing is these aren't dink and dunks. 11.9 yards per target, that was second highest among qualified wide receivers. C.J. Stroud, who we all think is that dude, made Nico Collins, he has no problem chucking it deep to Nico Collins. And you just sort of think about, it's one of the reasons why I think Joe Mixon is interesting this year, because again, Nico Collins, Tank Dell, Stephon Diggs, pick your poison. All three of them, you have to bring somebody with them. All three of them kick the lid off the defense. And so, I just think you're going to have to play too high safety against these guys all the time, and I just think there's going to be an empty box for Mixon.
Yeah, they have speed, and I agree with you on Mixon completely. I think we almost, not we, but everyone, overall overlooks Nico Collins. How good Nico Collins is, because he wasn't a first-round pick. Yep. He was a late bloomer in fantasy by all metrics of how long it took him to break out. I think Nico Collins is just so much better than what Stephon Diggs is right now. And Tank Dell's awesome, but Tank Dell's a totally different player. 165 pounds, burner. He has a specific role in that offense. I think people have fear with Diggs there about, hey, can Collins still command this target share? I don't. I just think he's so much better right now, and that rapport with Stroud is built in. And Nico Collins is an absolute big-bodied monster in the red zone that will get his touchdown equity as well.
Yep. To me, the most indicative stat around Nico Collins that speaks to how amazing he is on the field is that he was second in the entire NFL in yards per route run last year. And that stat is meaningful because number one in the league was Tyreek Hill, 2 is Collins, and then 3, 4, 5, Brandon Ayuk, Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb. That is the company that Nico Collins was in last season.
Yeah, it's crazy company for Collins.
And the only knock on Nico Collins is literally target share because Diggs and Dell are there. But I agree with you. Nico Collins is that good. C.J. Stroud is that good. And we're not sure yet about, of all the Texans wide receivers, Tank Dell coming back from the injury, Stephon Diggs, who, just seemed to hit a wall over the second half of last year. There's less questions about Nico Collins than either of the other guys he's competing with for targets. You feel much better about Nico than you do the other guys. I'm in on Tank Dell this year. Tank's my guy, but I'm just saying, if you want to take a contrarian view, that's the anti-argument there. But yeah, Nico's just awesome.
So you mentioned Jaylen Waddle, how he might move up, Matthew, and eventually lead that Tier 3. Is this the year where he can maybe close the gap, not close it entirely, but make it tighter between him and Tyreek Hill?
I hope so. I mean, listen, this is somebody who, coming out of college was,
massive talent.
Massive talent as well.
And he's been good. It's not like he's been disappointing at all. He just is in an offense with Tyreek Hill.
Well, exactly. Any other offense, he's the number one wide receiver as well. Jaylen Waddle has 14 games over the last 2 years since McDaniel took over. 14 games with at least 7 targets. And in those games, he's averaging 20 fantasy points per game. 70 receptions, at least 70 receptions, and at least 1,000 receiving yards in all 3 career seasons as well. The only concern with Jaylen Waddle last year is that there was an inconsistency, right? Under 13 fantasy points in 8 of his 14 games last year. There was a little bit of an inconsistency there as they sort of struggled to move the ball around. Part of the other problem is it's hard to catch the ball when Devon Achane is running 80 yards for a touchdown every single time. They had so many weird games last year in terms of some of the big runs and that I feel like it'll be more of a normal year this year for the Dolphins. And so I do think this is the year that Waddle sort of puts it all together and closes the gap between him and Tyreek Hill.
Yep, he's just banged up as well at the start of last season, which I think always gets overlooked. I would expect from Waddle more resembling what he did 2 years ago, which we finished as wide receiver 8 overall in fantasy, 1,300 plus yards. And that's not like Tyreek Hill's doing nothing. Tyreek Hill had 1,700 yards that year in wide receiver 2. Tua has shown that he can support 2 different top 8 wide receivers in that Mike McDaniel system. So with health, I think that Waddle can get there. Again, just the end of the season is brutal if you're going to use that as a differentiator. The last 2 games at the Jets, at the Browns.
Another guy in this tier, in Devontae Smith, Matthew, obviously a great talent and a good offense, but there were just a few too many games last year where he entirely disappeared, inexplicably.
50% of his games last year, he had 5 or fewer targets. Not receptions, 5 or fewer targets.
Disappearing, yeah.
Again, part of the issue of him being on such a good team in the Eagles, they have a very good defense, right? Or in theory, they'll have a very good defense last year. Yeah, and you've got A.J. Brown, you've got Goddard, and now you had Barkley to the mix as well. And so that's the only issue with Devontae Smith, is just like there are games where he just disappears. So in terms of like consistency, it's tough. But here's somebody who's out there a ton, like 8th in routes per game. He led all wide receivers with a 96% snap share. 8 different games with 7 or more targets. It was a little bit feast or famine with Devontae Smith. Hopefully he gets a little bit more consistency this year, but that's the reason why that he's down here at wide receiver 20 for me, is just because when he's great, but just there are weeks where it just feels like, what happened?
Yep. I think as well, Devontae Smith, maybe some people have forgotten about it, but he went through a really rough patch in the middle of the year where it was almost like he kind of got the yips for a little bit, where he only brought in 5 of 11 targets against the Jets. He had 1 catch in a game against the Rams. So it just felt like he was in his own head a little bit. And then he got out of that, had a massive playoff game that, again, no one paid attention to because they were getting blown out by the Bucs. But I think he'll bounce back and he'll be fine.
So the other thing is that the Eagles offense just was, the whole team was a mess last year in terms of what, there was.
It just felt a little off. Everything felt a little off.
It just felt off.
Maybe Kellen Moore finds consistency with it.
Yeah,
that's why
that's the thing. I think it just felt like, there was all sorts of questions on the defensive side of the ball as well. Seemed like Brian Johnson was in over his head a little bit as offensive coordinator last year for the Eagles. So it just, the whole, season just felt discombobulated. So hopefully there's a little more consistency this season.
So to recap, that tier 3 starts with Devontae Adams at 13, then Deebo Samuel, Jaylen Waddle, who could be on the move, Mike Evans, Cooper Kupp, Malik Neighbors, Brandon Ayuk, Devontae Smith. Let's take a look at Matthew's wide receiver rankings 21 to 30, because tier 3 continues into DJ Moore at 21, Stephon Diggs at 22, and then it ends with DK Metcalf at 23, Matthew.
Yeah, that's the next tier as well. Pittman starting tier 4 there. Here's the thing about DK Metcalf, right? Ryan Grubb is going to push the ball, right? No team led the FBS, and no team had more passing yards per game from 2022 to 2023 than Washington and the Huskies under Ryan Grubb. They're going to push the ball down. So each of the past 4 seasons, here's a list, right? Here's a list of all the wide receivers that had at least 225 fantasy points each of the last 4 years. Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams, Stephon Diggs, Mike Evans, and DK Metcalf. The crown is yours. I'm just saying here, DK Metcalf, such a big. Thank you very much. That one's for Leroy too.
No, that was for us. We both like that.
Fair enough. Look, the other thing about DK is he's such a big target in the end zone, in the red zone. Top 5 in end zone targets every season of his career. Every season of his career, this is a guy who's top 5 in end zone targets. He's just built different. And so if you buy into sort of the resurgence of the Seattle offense under Ryan Grubb, Lockett feels like JSN is sort of ascending and Lockett is kind of backing off a little bit. But ultimately, we like Geno. We think Geno's good enough to get the ball to somebody, and the person he's going to get the ball to is DK Metcalf.
I think Geno's going to be really good in this offense. You watch the last 2 years of Michael Penix. He went from being an afterthought transfer to a top 10 pick in the draft. And I'm not taking away the credit from Penix, but Grubb was a huge part of that. And Grubb's going to really help all these wide receivers, but specifically Geno with the pass attack.
Yep. I think that was the idea that Geno was going to play a bit in that last preseason game, give him some extended run. First drive goes 4 for 5, 158 passer rating, touchdown. It's like, all right, I'm done. Let's just get him out of there. He looks so good. So I think that, he should have a big year. I think that Seattle team overall is just going to be a little more modernized. They've gone from the oldest head coach in the league to now the youngest. I think there's some exciting things happening in Seattle, and I want to buy shares, both that offense and defense.
Okay, you have a chance to win $1 million in the NBC sweepstakes on Yahoo Fantasy. Just download the redesigned Yahoo Fantasy app or go to NBCSports.com/fantasymillion for additional details. What are you waiting for?
Hey, it's Matthew Berry from NBCSports.com and Rotorworld.com, and I want to thank you so much for watching whatever it is you just watched, or if nothing else, being too lazy to click out of the autoplay after this video started, after whatever it is you actually wanted to watch finished. But now that you're here, I'd like to take a moment here to ask you respectfully now, okay? I'm asking you respectfully to subscribe to the NFL on NBC YouTube channel. You'll get the latest Roto-World fantasy news headlines, all sorts of great shows, including my own Fantasy Football Happy Hour. So go subscribe now. Again, I'm asking respectfully.